Because the church has always been a multitude of churches in very differing local and social contexts and differing parts of the world. And of course, in the early centuries of the church, it spread further and further. And then in more recent centuries, it's spread to every corner of the globe. But the gospel is practiced and understood and borne witness to in different places and contexts in ways that must make sense to those contexts, in language that makes sense, in cultural forms that make sense, but also attentive to the challenges and problems of those specific areas. Rolling out a normative one-size-fits-all model of the church and how the church must live its life and interpret the gospel and put the gospel into practice, heavily influenced from a European, Eurocentric perspective, no longer really works for today's world. And Pope Francis, of course, comes from Argentina, from Latin America. He fully understands this, his perspective understands that. But I think also the bishops of the world and the cardinals in particular who elected Pope Francis understood this. Before Pope Francis was elected, they met for several days, the cardinals, and thrashed out what they thought were the priorities for today's church. And so it's not as if Pope Francis is purely engaging with his own agenda and priorities for the church. He is also carrying out that mandate from the cardinals who elected him, who said we must be attentive to the local problems of the church in different places. And I think we're seeing really a return to a theme that's been there at different stages of the church's history, that the church in its own locality is the church, and therefore there must be local forms of being attentive to the challenges for that specific context, and local forms of preaching the gospel, celebrating the liturgy, and also of making sense of the fundamental teachings for the church too. Magisterium is a term that really, what it refers to has been there with the church from the beginning. It's a more recent term in being employed regularly. It's really only in the 19th and 20th century it becomes a central concept. But it refers to how the church teaches with authority, the practice of teaching with authority, which in its sense refers to something that's been there right from the beginning of making sense of the faith, bearing witness to it, making the gracious self-communication of the God of love come alive in different contexts, in different places. Now, for much of the history of the Latin term, and of course the term most Christians who've ever lived would, the term would be alien to them, but including to many today. But the term in its Latin sense primarily refers to a function, an activity. In the 19th century, particularly the second half of the 19th century, it began to see a shift in meaning, and it began to be referred to the people who carry out the activity. So like a confusion between government and governance. So people talk about government, and that can be equivalent to the act of governing or governance. But when many people talk about the government, they're talking about the group of people primarily charged with carrying out government and governing. The shift of a similar nature happened in the church. So by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, people began to refer to the magisterium and identify it with the hierarchy, the bishops and the pope. And eventually it became this understood in a very authoritarian and monolithic way that the magisterium is this group of people who are the only people who can try to make sense of the faith and interpret the church's teachings for new times and new places. Whereas the history of the church shows that everyone in the church is called to bear witness, is called to take part in the teaching mission of the church, the sensus fidelium, for example, that the whole people of God determine and acknowledge what is and what isn't fundamentally part of the church's deposit of faith, and which makes sense of that. So Pope Francis seems to be encouraging this older form of understanding that magisterium is a much more participatory thing that includes everyone in the church. And of course, throughout history, theologians have contributed to it. But also, particularly in recent times, we've seen an emphasis upon remembering that people such as the poor have a lot to teach the church too, because they speak out of particular contexts and experiences, and that too contributes to the official teaching of the church. And I think this is one of the things Pope Francis is emphasising again. I already mentioned that he's broadening the participation. He's encouraging a much more dialogical church. He's encouraging the laity to take on more responsibility. He's also encouraging episcopal collegiality. He really believes in Vatican II's vision for this. And he's also encouraging local churches to address their own needs in ways that make most sense for those locations. And he's empowering local bishops to do that, but also telling bishops they must listen to the faithful and learn from them too. And sometimes they will learn a great deal from the faithful. So he's really shifting the emphasis upon hierarchy or centre out to one of periphery in and from below. So he's helping to encourage this sense of participation, dialogue throughout the church. He's encouraging people to make their contribution to putting the faith into practice and to making sense of the faith as well. So I think fundamentally he's also encouraging open and frank discussion. He's also encouraging that people must understand that the pastoral mission of putting the gospel into practice is for the first and foremost important reason why the church exists. The church doesn't exist for its own institutions or to defend its own rigid positions year in, year out, century in, century out. The doctrines, the structures exist to serve the pastoral mission of putting the gospel into practice. And on occasion, sometimes people forget this and get it the wrong way around, and we've lived in periods, including recent periods, where this has happened. Francis is saying, let's get back to getting our priorities in the right order. Pope Francis says himself in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium from 2013, that it's very sad and it's a great danger to the church that there will be people who will say, we have always done it this way. But of course in any institution you will always find people who are fearful of change, and because people get very comfortable with the way things are, and that leads them to believe that the way in which things have been done for maybe only a relatively few years is the way it's always been done. Or the way in which things have been understood is the way it's always been understood. And history of the church tells you that that is rarely ever the case. There's dynamism, there's change, there's development, there's evolution. Sometimes there's complete reversals. The church's teaching on things such as slavery, for example, has changed. The church's attitude towards people of other faiths has thankfully changed, especially again, also very positively. Sometimes the church's teaching has changed in a negative way. The church's ban on usury has, in certain periods of the church's history, that was forgotten, and so therefore the church lost a powerful way of holding in check perhaps some of the most exploitative forces in our society. So it's really a way of making the gospel come alive, Pope Francis thinks, and the obstacles will be people who fear change, people who come from a particular ecclesiological standpoint and particular factions who may have been of much greater influence in recent times but no longer are. And also there are some people who think that defending the faith is about defending rigid interpretations of what the faith is about and rigid moral principles, as if you can apply moral laws in all times and all places without attention to specific cases and contexts. If you go back to St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, he shows that that can't be the case. He says everyone knows it's our duty to do good and to shun evil. What it is to discern what is good and evil in a given case, in a given context, is very difficult to determine. And most of the work of moral theology, ethics, is about determining those grey areas in the middle. Pope Francis gets this, and I think the Synod recently also gets this. But you'll always see people, especially in this postmodern age, who feel that certitude is much more appealing. It's a little easier to deal with because you can say, well, I have my 10 rules and I have my canon law, and so it's clear what we must do in every case, in every context. And of course, even canon law makes clear that that isn't the case. And so I think the obstacles will be people who resist change, people who find comfort in much more rigid formulae and principles. And I think, Pope Francis himself is also talking about the people who really defend the faith are those who not so much rigidly impose the law and use doctrines as stones to throw at people and sit in judgment, but rather it's the people who try to uphold the spirit of what the gospel means in given places for given times.